There's a new book out by a well-respected journalist. The author is William Arkin. The book is called American Coup, How a Terrified Government is Destroying the Constitution. Good morning, William Arkin.
Thanks for having me on, McGraw.
Looking at this book, I would think you were a black helicopters quack, but your experience tells me you're a well-respected journalist. The idea of the book is that there is some type of secondary government set up?
Well, it's not the idea of the book. I prove it. The reality is that we live in a country today that has two sets of rules, what I call the ABCs of the Constitution and the laws of our land, and the XYZs, which is what exists between the lines in order to secure the national security. This has been going on since the Eisenhower administration, when a continuity of government program was set up for the possibility of there being an all-out nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But since 9/11, these programs have revived, revamped, and now we have a belief that doomsday is every day, that an attack on the United States could come from anywhere, that it could be any place, and that it could happen any time with anything. And so a group of people who are charged with preserving the security of the nation went from this sort of small program that existed in the Eisenhower through Bush administration years to now a gigantic entity which is increasingly in control of all aspects of what become our priorities in national security.
What's so terrible about the government planning for a continuity of government scenario if, God forbid, something terrible goes wrong?
There's nothing wrong with it per se. I think that the fact that the government prepares for the worst is probably a good idea. However, the government is the government. They always overshoot. They always underperform. They always waste our money. And a lot of this goes on in secret and in a way that really infringes upon and has an impact on civil liberties, has an impact on state-federal relationships, has an impact on domestic security. So there's nothing wrong with continuity of government per se. I'm not a black helicopter kind of guy, but on the other hand, I've spent decades in Washington reporting on the national security establishment. And what I began to hear after 9/11 was that there was something else going on and that it was going to transform the nation. And now I look at Missouri and Kansas and I see a Homeland Security Department and I see an intelligence fusion center and I see a terrorism early warning group and a joint terrorism task force and I see a National Guard increasingly involving itself in weapons of mass destruction and homeland response. And what I don't see are necessarily the governors in the states caring for the needs of the states as their first priority. What I see is them increasingly becoming enlisted in a national security effort that is written in Washington, and that ultimately undermines the needs of people at the local level and ultimately changes what our priorities are in terms of how we see our day-to-day lives.
The book is called American Coup, How a Terrified Government is Destroying the Constitution. William Arkin is the author. It's one thing if we plan for a terrorist attack or we gather information, but how is it destroying the Constitution and how is it destroying our personal freedom?
Well, okay, so two things. One, we live in a country that is based upon a system of federalism. The states got together. They created a United States. The federal government didn't get together and decide, let's go have 50 states and we'll just parse out the power to each of them. Most of the local police powers, most of the powers regarding the use of the National Guard and what goes on inside a state still resides with the state and with the governor. However, since 9/11, that has reversed. And increasingly, the federal government, under the notion of whole of community response or whole of nation response or the needs of counterterrorism, have said to the states, you need to get with us. You need to get with the program. You need to put yourself subordinate to Washington, D.C. and the federal government. I think everybody sees it going on in all aspects of their lives, and they don't necessarily associate it with some post-9/11 phenomena, but the reality is, McGraw, that this is something that's happening that is changing the very nature of how our country is organized.
Well,
the other answer is NSA. I mean, all these stories that are coming out about the intelligence community, voraciously collecting everything it can get its hands on, even inside the United States, is not coming from nowhere. It's not coming. The NSA didn't wake up one morning and say, we want to do this. The NSA is reacting to what the needs of the government are. The government says to the intelligence community, here's the information we need. And so we have to step one step further back and say, why is it that all of a sudden the intelligence community is being told by the government we need to know everything about everyone? And the answer to that question, I think, is that the government perceives that anyone who is not an involved person in first responders, in volunteer organizations, in the military-industrial complex as part of the government or as part of some volunteer effort supporting Homeland Security is potentially an enemy. And so they don't know who the enemies are and they don't know where they are, but they're going to find them. And that's why we see this erosion of our civil liberties and the increasing collection of this promiscuous intelligence.
American Coup is the book. William Arkin, our guest. You say that after Reagan was shot, it was not a surprise when Alexander Haig said, I'm in control. What did you mean by that?
Well, it was not a surprise because the reality is that there has always been this secondary governance that's existed. There's always been this organization which exists at the highest level within the White House and at the highest level within the national security agencies who are charged with taking control if the government and the country should collapse. The interesting element of today is that the government is so much larger, the national security establishment is so much bigger, and the country is perceived to be so much more fragile that that a blackout or a communications glitch or a cyber event, could spell the end of so many aspects of American society. And so there's this belief in Washington, which has grown in the last decade, that the people who once were really just on standby where they're in all-out nuclear war are now on standby for whether something happens today. Well, if you're on standby to know whether something happens today, it means you got to do a lot of prep work in order to be ready, and that's what's going on behind the scenes.
William Arkin, fascinating look, co-author of the book Top Secret America and author of Codenames. His new book is American Coup, How a Terrified Government is Destroying the Constitution. William Arkin. William, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thanks for having me on, McGraw.
You got it. Check that, 7:58. Quick check of traffic and weather, Frank.